The sun dipped behind the red hills, washing the Wyoming sky in gold and ash. A cool wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying the scent of sage and dust to Red Creek Ranch. Jackson Cole stood at the edge of the fence line, a silhouette against the dying light, his gloved hands gripping the rail as if the wood itself might steady the storm inside him. It had been 5 long years since he'd buried his first wife and the child she never lived to bear. Since then, he'd spoken few words that weren't about cattle, land, or weather. Love had died with them, and he'd convinced himself he didn't need it anymore. But the silence of his ranch had become a kind of ache he could no longer ignore. When he sent for a mail-order bride, the town couldn't believe it. The men who drank with him at the saloon joked that he'd lost his mind, and the women whispered that no decent woman would come all that way for a man as broken as him. But Jackson didn't care for gossip. He hadn't ordered a bride for affection or companionship. At least, that's what he told himself. He wanted someone to bring life back into the hollow rooms of his home, someone gentle enough to fill the space his grief had claimed. The train whistle wailed through the hills, low and lonesome. Jackson pulled his hat low and walked toward the station, boots crunching over the gravel. He stood apart from the others, waiting on the platform, tall and still as the post beside him. The train hissed and groaned to a stop, metal wheels screeching against the tracks. Steam billowed through the air, blurring faces and figures until one emerged from the mist. A small woman in a faded blue dress, clutching a carpet bag and a letter tied with ribbon. Evelyn Grace. Jackson had read her letters every night for a month. Her handwriting was neat, her words simple but sincere. She'd written of her childhood in a small Massachusetts town, her years of caring for a sick mother, and the loneliness that followed her mother's passing. She'd written that she wanted a chance to build something lasting, something real. And in those letters, Jackson had seen a quiet courage he couldn't explain. Now, as he watched her step down from the train, he saw that same courage in the way she held herself, even as her eyes darted nervously across the crowd. "Mrs. Cole?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, roughened by years of silence. She turned toward him, startled. I suppose that's me," she said softly, her voice trembling but polite. He nodded, tipping his hat. "Jackson Cole, welcome to Red Creek." Evelyn smiled faintly and extended her hand. Her fingers were small and pale against his calloused palm. For a moment, the world went quiet. Her skin was warm, fragile, yet steady. He released her hand reluctantly and reached for her bag. "This all you've got?" "Yes," she said, looking down at the worn leather handle. "It's enough for me." He nodded again, approving the practicality in her answer. Without another word, he led her to the wagon waiting nearby. They climbed aboard, and the horses started down the dusty road, hooves beating steady against the hard-packed earth. The ride was long and mostly silent. Evelyn kept her eyes on the horizon, watching the land roll out in waves of grass and rock, so unlike the green valleys of home. She felt small in this vast place, like a speck beneath the endless sky. Jackson's profile was stern and unreadable, but something about him felt safe, not gentle, but solid, like the mountains in the distance. After a while, she gathered the courage to speak. "It's beautiful here," she said quietly. Jackson glanced her way. "Takes some getting used to," he replied. "The land's honest, though. It gives back what you put in." She nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "That's all I've ever wanted. A place to belong. A place that gives back." He said nothing, but his eyes softened a little. The wind tugged at her bonnet, and a few strands of hair blew across her face. He resisted the urge to reach out and brush them away. By the time they reached the ranch, the last light of day had faded into a soft blue dusk. The main house stood tall on a rise, sturdy and weathered from years of wind and rain. The porch lantern flickered faintly, casting warm light against the wood. Evelyn's breath caught at the sight. It wasn't fancy or grand, but it looked like a place with history, a place that had endured. Jackson helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady at her waist. She hesitated before stepping onto the porch, glancing toward the fields that stretched endlessly beyond. "I had a room fixed up for you," Jackson said, his tone gruff but kind. "Upstairs. Fresh linens, window faces the sunrise. Supper's at 7. Evelyn nodded, her heart fluttering with a mix of gratitude and nerves. Thank you, Mr. Cole. He paused, looking at her for a moment. Jackson, he corrected softly. You can call me Jackson. Something in the way he said it made her chest tighten. She smiled faintly and followed him inside. The house smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, the air thick with the silence of a man who had lived too long alone. She could see traces of another life here, a woman's shawl folded neatly on a chair, a photograph on the mantel turned slightly toward the wall. Upstairs, she unpacked her few belongings, 2 dresses, a comb, a Bible, and her father's locket. She opened it, gazing at the faded portrait inside. I'll be all right, Papa, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'll make this work. Downstairs, she heard the heavy creak of boots on the floorboards, the sound of dishes, the low murmur of a man lost in thought. She wanted to thank him again, to ask him about the ranch, about his life. But something held her back. He seemed to carry a weight she didn't yet understand, and she was afraid of touching it too soon. That night, rain began to fall, tapping gently against the window pane. Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm. Somewhere below she heard the faint crackle of a fire and the slow pacing of footsteps. He was awake too. She imagined him sitting by the hearth, hat in his hands, staring into the flames the way lonely men do when they can't sleep. In that great, quiet house, 2 people lay awake, one mourning what he'd lost, the other praying for what she hoped to find. And though neither of them knew it yet, their lives had already begun to intertwine like roots beneath the soil, silent and unseen, but growing toward each other all the same. The days at Red Creek Ranch fell into a rhythm that was both strange and comforting to Evelyn. Morning light would spill through her window, and she'd rise before the rooster's cry, tying her hair back and lighting the stove. She'd learned quickly how the ranch worked, when to fetch water, how to churn butter, when to gather eggs before the heat of day. The work was tiring but honest, and it gave her something she'd never had before, purpose. Jackson moved through the ranch like a man welded to its land. He was up before dawn, driving the cattle, fixing fences, checking the irrigation lines that fed his acres of hay. He rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, but Evelyn learned to read him in other ways, the set of his shoulders when he was troubled, the slow release of his breath when something pleased him, the way his gaze softened when she offered him a cup of coffee after a long morning. He wasn't cruel or distant, just careful, as if every word might break something fragile. Evelyn had written in her diary one evening, "He is not a cold man, only one who has forgotten how to be warm." She had no idea if he'd ever read the letters she sometimes left on the kitchen table, small notes of gratitude, tiny pieces of herself she didn't know how else to share. He never said a word about them, but she found them tucked neatly into the pages of an old ranch ledger one afternoon, as if he'd kept them hidden for safekeeping. That discovery made her heart ache in the best way. Spring melted into summer, and the ranch came alive with color. Wildflowers burst across the fields, and the river near the north pasture shimmered in the sunlight. Jackson and Evelyn worked side by side more often now, she learning to ride, him patient but quiet as he guided her reins with his calloused hands. She fell once, landing in the dirt with a gasp, but before she could stand, he was there, his hand outstretched. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and firm. She nodded, brushing dust from her dress, cheeks flushed. "I'm fine." "You're stubborn," he said with the faintest smile. "I learned from the best," she replied without thinking, and that was the first time she saw him truly laugh. It was brief, rough around the edges, but real. The sound lingered in her mind long after they'd ridden back to the house. Despite the growing warmth between them, Jackson still carried a shadow. Some nights, she'd wake to find him standing outside under the stars, staring at the empty corral, as if seeing ghosts only he could name. She never intruded, but one evening, when the moon was bright and the crickets sang their soft hymn, she joined him quietly. "It's peaceful out here," she said, her voice gentle. He didn't look at her. "It used to be." She hesitated, then asked, "Was it your wife?" The question hung in the air like a trembling leaf. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then with a sigh he said, "Her name was Clara. She died when the house burned. I wasn't there to save her." His voice cracked on the last words. Evelyn's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry, Jackson." He shook his head. "Don't be. You didn't know her." "I don't have to know her to know what she meant to you," she whispered. That night, he didn't walk away. He stayed beside her, silent, staring at the stars until the first light of dawn painted the horizon pink.